What do you think is the worst horror franchise? Because I feel like a lot of people would maybe say the Hostel franchise, if they remember it at all. The Hostel franchise is largely remembered as being 2000s torture porn schlock that's kind of a Saw ripoff. And while those criticisms are understandable and certainly true of the first Hostel, I'm here to posit that Hostel Part 2 is actually a fantastic film, one of my favorite grindhouse horror films of all time, and a shockingly feminist story with a incredibly blatantly queer-coded final girl, potentially even canonically queer, that's debatable. In this essay, I will. But actually, I really did rewatch Hostel Part 2 recently because the last time I'd seen it was certainly like more than a decade ago. And I was starting to think that maybe I was crazy, okay? Because people don't like this movie. People still don't really talk super fondly of it on the internet. And at the time, it performed so badly that the third Hostel movie got switched to a straight-to-video release. So the thing is, people don't like this movie. But I also think that there was some real-world misogyny in the way that it was received because a big complaint when it came out was that it was just a gender-bent version of the first, where the first film had a cast of mainly men that became the victims of this hostel. The second was a group of women. And listen, I understand that a lot of people take issue with like the brutalization of women in horror. A lot of people think that just the mere act of illustrating the brutalization of women in horror is misogynistic. And while I think there's a line that you can certainly cross, I think it's a more nuanced issue than a lot of people want to give it credit for. If you want to read more about that, I highly recommend two books of Reverence and Rape, The Treatment of Women in the Movies by Molly Haskell, and Men, Women, and Chainsaws. She's written by Carol J. Clover. She's actually the person who coined the term final girl for the first time, although she kind of hates that she's known for that. The thing is not only does Hostel Part 2 like actually expand on the like in-world lore of the Hostel movies, which is actually one of the more creative and interesting concepts for a horror franchise, especially in like the grindhouse kind of genre, splatter gore, some might call it. But the thing is, not only does Hostel Part 2 elaborate on the like actually really creative world building and like concept of the Hostel series, which is more interesting than a lot of especially like splatter gore genre horror, but it also creates a story based on like full characters, not just the victims, but the killers too. And while like there are certainly several aspects of this film that have not aged well, that are very much a product of the time that it was made, the 2000s, and the person that was made it. And I do think that this film is another good example of like why we shouldn't necessarily moralize our art or idolize the people who make art, because you can definitely disagree strongly with an artist and still their art can resonate with you. But this film introduced like some very complex ideas in terms of like patriarchy and gender norms for the 2000s. Like, this story has two male killers in the story that are pitched to you as like one who's a bad guy and one who's a good guy. And it subverts expectations of these characters so fucking effectively. Introduced some pretty complex gender dynamics for the time. It's actually very impressive. Also, just the actual gore is very cool, very creative, and there's some really fucking good shit. I could talk for a very, very long time about why I love this movie and all of the things that it does well, and even some of the things that it doesn't do well. But I feel like this TikTok is already long enough. So that's my TED Talk. If you haven't seen Hostel Part 2, I do kind of recommend it. Like, it's not only fun, but it's like kind of rad.